There was a time when Charlie Murphy stood close enough to the brightest lights in American comedy to feel their heat, yet somehow remained in the shadows. He was the older brother of Eddie Murphy, one of the most recognizable comedians of his generation. But Charlie Murphy carried a story that was much larger than being somebody's brother. His life moved through grief, trouble, prison, the Navy, Hollywood, stand-up comedy, and finally a battle with cancer that he kept largely private. For years, people knew his voice before they knew the full story behind it. They laughed when he told stories about Rick James and Prince. They watched him on the Dave Chappelle Show. They saw him in movies and television shows, sometimes without realizing how much work had already gone into the man standing in front of the camera. But what happened before the laughter? How did a troubled young man from Brooklyn become one of America's most memorable storytellers? And why did so much of his talent remain underrated for so long? This is the Charlie Murphy story, a story about survival, family, laughter, and finding your own name in a world that already knew someone else's. Long before Charlie Murphy became known for making audiences laugh, his childhood had already taught him that life could change without warning. He was born on July 12, 1959, in Queens, New York, and was raised in Brooklyn and Long Island alongside his younger brother, Eddie. Their mother, Lillian, worked as a telephone operator, while their father, Charles Edward Murphy, worked as a drugstore delivery man and transit police officer and also had an interest in acting and comedy. When Charlie was 5, his parents divorced. He and Eddie moved to live near their grandmother, although their father continued to visit them. Those early years were not easy, but Charlie and Eddie found something that gave them a different kind of escape. They listened to comedy albums by performers such as Red Fox and Richard Pryor, absorbing the voices and rhythms that would eventually shape their own lives. Then, when Charlie was only 9 years old, tragedy entered the family. The transcript describes the death of his father in a violent incident involving his father's girlfriend. Charlie was still a child, and the loss became one of the defining shadows of his early life. Charlie also developed a reputation for being tough. He fought other children, and he often protected Eddie when trouble came looking for his younger brother. At home, however, the relationship between the two brothers could be just as intense. Charlie joked about Eddie. Eddie sometimes reacted angrily, and their childhood arguments became part of the complicated bond they carried into adulthood. There was an important difference between the brothers. Eddie seemed to recognize his future early. He watched television constantly, memorized television guides, studied famous performers, and practiced impressions in the mirror. Charlie had humor too, but his path was much less certain. At 10 years old, Charlie appeared in the 1970 film The Landlord, which had been filmed in his neighborhood after his mother entered his name for casting. In that sense, Charlie Murphy had stepped into show business before Eddie Murphy became famous. But the road ahead was far from simple. As a teenager, Charlie was suspended from school for fighting and became increasingly involved with drugs, stealing, and street life. After his family moved to Long Island, he struggled to fit into a new environment and found connections with other young people who felt like outsiders. Eventually, Charlie joined a street gang, was arrested for robbing a taxi driver, violated probation, and spent a year in jail at 18. It was a difficult chapter, but it also became the beginning of a decision that changed the direction of his life. After leaving jail, Charlie joined the Navy because he wanted to stay away from the streets. He became a boiler technician and served for 6 years. The man who had once seemed headed toward a very different future was slowly beginning to understand that survival was not enough. He needed a purpose of his own. For Charlie Murphy, leaving the Navy was not the end of his transformation. It was the moment when he finally had to decide whether he would spend the rest of his life standing beside Eddie Murphy or build something that belonged entirely to himself. By 1984, Eddie had become a major star. He had appeared on Saturday Night Live and in films such as 48 Hours and Trading Places, and his stand-up career was taking off. Eddie wanted Charlie to become his head of security, and Charlie eventually left the Navy after 6 years. For a while, he traveled everywhere with his younger brother, meeting celebrities and seeing a side of Hollywood that most people only imagined. Charlie became friends with Mike Tyson and crossed paths with Rick James, who was working with Eddie at the time. He also experienced the wild atmosphere surrounding places such as Studio 54. But behind all of that excitement, Charlie understood something important. Being Eddie Murphy's protector was not the same as having a purpose of his own. So he started writing. His first major screenplay was The Peddler, a story connected to New York drug lord Nicky Barnes. According to the original account, Charlie sold the script to Paramount Pictures for $150,000. Eddie was supposed to star, but his management did not want him to take the role because of concerns about his public image. The project remained unreleased. Charlie kept moving. He continued writing and began pursuing acting roles. He appeared in television and eventually landed roles in films including Harlem Nights, M.O. Better Blues, Jungle Fever, and CB4. His work was not always the center of attention, but Charlie was steadily building something that was his. He was becoming more than Eddie Murphy's brother. Then came the role that changed how millions of people remembered him. In 2003, Charlie joined the Dave Chappelle Show. He began telling the writers stories about people he had known, including Rick James and Prince. Those stories became some of the most memorable sketches associated with the show, turning Charlie into a storyteller whose voice could not easily be copied. The stories worked because Charlie did not tell them like polished Hollywood legends. He told them like memories from a life that had actually been lived. His Prince story became unforgettable. His Rick James story became part of American comedy culture. And suddenly, the man who had spent years standing behind someone else's spotlight was standing directly in his own. Charlie Murphy was now recognized for something that belonged to him. His career continued through stand-up comedy, television, movies, voice acting, and writing. He appeared in projects such as The Boondocks, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, Norbit, and other productions that reached audiences across America. Yet, even after all that success, the word underrated still followed him. That was the strange part of Charlie Murphy's story. He had survived a troubled childhood, prison, the streets, the Navy, Hollywood rejection, and years of being compared with one of the biggest comedians in the world. And somehow, he still found a way to make people laugh. That laughter would soon become even more meaningful, because behind the confidence and the stories was a man whose private life carried wounds that the audience rarely saw. For years, Charlie Murphy had built his career around laughter. He could walk into a room, tell a story, and make people forget their worries for a few minutes. But behind that confidence was a private life that carried a different kind of silence. In 1997, Charlie married Tisha Taylor, the woman he described as someone he fell in love with almost immediately. Their relationship became an important part of his life, and together they built a family away from much of the attention surrounding Hollywood. Then, in 2009, everything changed. Tisha Taylor Murphy died from cervical cancer at the age of 40. According to the original account, she died in her sleep at the family's home in New Jersey, just days before Christmas. Charlie was devastated. The detail that stayed with him was deeply personal. The account said that Tisha had made arrangements for her own funeral because she did not want Charlie to carry that burden. Behind the comedian people knew from television was a husband trying to understand how to continue after losing the person he loved. And still, Charlie kept working. He appeared on television, continued acting, released stand-up material, and remained part of the comedy world. He appeared in projects including Are We There Yet?, Lottery Ticket, Black Jesus, Meet the Blacks, and Power. His career had never followed a straight line. He had started as a troubled teenager, spent time in jail, joined the Navy, protected Eddie Murphy, wrote screenplays, acted in movies, and eventually became an accomplished stand-up comedian. But the hardest chapter was still ahead. In 2017, Charlie appeared in the comedy Get Down and continued working while privately dealing with leukemia. According to the transcript, he kept much of his illness away from the public and disclosed his condition only to a small circle of close friends and family. That privacy was consistent with the man people had come to know. Charlie had spent his life telling stories about other people, but he did not always tell the world everything about himself. On April 12, 2017, Charlie Murphy died from leukemia at the age of 57. The news shocked many people. Friends and colleagues had not fully understood how serious his condition had become. He was still connected to the comedy world, still working, and still part of a touring group that included Cedric the Entertainer, Eddie Griffin, D.L. Hughley, and George Lopez. Suddenly, the laughter stopped. Comedians and friends gathered to remember him. Dave Chappelle, George Lopez, Cedric the Entertainer, Eddie Griffin, Neil Brennan, and others paid their respects. Eddie Murphy had lost his older brother. The comedy world had lost a storyteller, and audiences had lost a man whose greatest gift had always been turning memories, mistakes, strange encounters, and painful chapters into stories people could carry with them. Charlie Murphy had spent much of his life fighting to become more than someone else's brother. In the end, he had become Charlie Murphy. In America, Charlie Murphy was remembered in a way that went beyond his connection to Eddie Murphy. For many viewers, he became the voice behind some of the most recognizable stories from the Dave Chappelle Show, especially the stories involving Rick James and Prince. His appeal came from something simple. Charlie sounded like someone telling a story across a kitchen table, not someone trying to create a perfect Hollywood image. His humor carried the rough edges of real life, and that made his stories feel personal to audiences who had grown up with American comedy. The reaction after his death reflected that connection. Fellow comedians, actors, friends, and fans remembered Charlie not simply as a famous man's brother, but as a comedian, writer, actor, and storyteller who had created his own place in American entertainment. International audiences encountered Charlie through the same films, television shows, video games, and comedy programs that carried American popular culture around the world. But the deeper meaning of his story was easier to understand when viewed through his entire life. Charlie Murphy represented a particular kind of American journey. He came from hardship, made serious mistakes, changed direction, entered the military, found his voice in entertainment, and eventually became known for stories that crossed generations. That is why the word underrated continued to follow his name. Charlie Murphy had spent years proving that being close to greatness did not mean living in someone else's shadow. His life showed that sometimes the hardest part of success was simply being seen for who you had become. Charlie Murphy's life did not end with the applause. It ended with the silence that comes when someone who made millions of people laugh is suddenly no longer there to tell another story. He had lived through more than most people ever knew. He had experienced childhood loss, trouble in the streets, prison, military service, Hollywood rejection, family conflict, professional success, and the devastating loss of his wife. Through all of it, Charlie Murphy kept moving forward. That may be the deepest part of his legacy. He was not simply Eddie Murphy's older brother. He was not only the man who told the world about Rick James and Prince. He was a writer who helped create films, an actor who built a long list of credits, a stand-up comedian who learned how to handle audiences after being booed, and a storyteller who turned memories into moments people could remember for years. His journey also explained why the phrase underrated comedian remained so closely connected to his name. Charlie Murphy had talent, experience, and a life filled with stories, but recognition did not always arrive at the same time as the talent. For many Americans who watched the Dave Chappelle Show, his voice became part of a particular era of comedy. His stories about Prince and Rick James became cultural memories, but behind those stories was a man who had spent decades becoming the person capable of telling them. Charlie Murphy's legacy was not built from one movie or one television appearance. It was built from persistence. He had once been a young man who did not know where his life was going. He had made mistakes that could have defined him forever. Instead, he found another direction, served in the Navy, entered entertainment, and eventually found a voice that belonged completely to him. That is what makes the Charlie Murphy story worth remembering. Sometimes a person can spend years standing beside someone famous before the world finally notices the person standing there. Charlie Murphy found his own light, and even after that light went out, the stories remained. For anyone who remembers Charlie Murphy, perhaps the best way to honor him is not only to remember how funny he was. Remember how much life stood behind the laughter. Remember the struggle. Remember the resilience. Remember the man who kept becoming someone new. If Charlie Murphy ever made you laugh, or if one of his stories stayed with you, share that memory below. Sometimes a legacy survives in the simplest way possible, when one person remembers and tells another. Charlie Murphy may have been called an underrated comedian, But his story became larger than that label. He left behind laughter, stories, work, family memories, and a reminder that a difficult beginning does not have to determine the final chapter. Some stories end without closure, but dignity does not need applause.